Hi, and welcome to this special episode of the OrgDev podcast. Now, we're bringing you something different and packed full of fascinating insights. It's a conversation from an exclusive session I recently delivered in my role as chair of CIPD London OD&D Network, featuring the brilliant Dr. Eliat Aram, CEO of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Dr. Aram is a leading thinker and practitioner in systems psychodynamics and organisational change, with a deep expertise in the unconscious processes that shape leadership, teams, and transformation. Now, Tavistock's influence on the field of organisation development is profound. In our discussion, we explore how organisations navigate complexity, the hidden dynamics that impact leadership, and what it really takes to create adaptive, human-centred workplaces. So we really hope you enjoy this session, you get loads of value from it, and feel free to share your insights in the comments. And if you feel this is something that would be valuable for others to learn about in terms of the world of group dynamics, then please feel free to share this video with others.
Institute, as you have just said, has been around for a long time, and we combine deep psychological insight with a system thinking approach to help organizations navigate that complexity, which we will talk about more. We work beneath the surface. We explore the unseen dynamics, those of individual, group, and systemic. And our work is not about quick fixes, but enabling sustainable change through reflective practice as well as action research. So we have an array of organizational development practice, professional development programs, and quite a substantial portfolio of research.
Brilliant. And when you say working beneath the surface, I think that's probably an important thing, isn't it? Because we're in HR in particular, or OD, we see lots of events, don't we? But really, this is about looking is going beneath the surface, what might be driving that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's to do with that concept known as the unconscious, which we will talk about more when we talk about the group dynamics and how to understand them. For example, we do quite a lot of work with NHS leadership, and one of the aspects of that has been to uncover unconscious resistance to organizational change, which I will also come back to later. We do work with the European Union on social policies that also explore systemic impacts on employment and welfare. And we also do a lot of work in social cohesion and migration to explore how communities self-organize in response to external pressure. So one of the aspects of analyzing group dynamics and the tensions between inclusion and exclusion, the project helped to shape more effective policies and interventions. So this is something about how our work crosses disciplines, if you like, and practices.
So what key principles should OD practitioners keep in mind? So a lot of the people joining us on the call today will be seeing uncertainty around them, even just from a geopolitical perspective, an economy perspective. What key principles should OD practitioners keep in mind when navigating uncertainty?
Yeah, so in principle, these will be the top 5, if you like, points. So staying with uncertainty rather than rush to solution requires what Bion called reverie, which is a state of openness without memory or desire, allowing for deep listening and emergent thinking. And consultants need to resist in our mind, in our methodology, the urge to impose certainty where actually no certainty or very little certainty exists. The second has to do with acknowledging and working with resistance. It's important because even when organizations want to change or people say that they want to change, actually unconscious forces often pull them back to the familiar. In a way, if you like, better the devil we know. So that can feel safer than what is unknown, even though we consciously and rationally aspire to improve and to be better. So the role of the OD consultant is not just to propose the change, but also help the organization sit with the discomfort and work through the blockages. And then the third is adopt the stance of an anthropologist, which I can say more about that later, but overall, it's rather than judging or fixing an organization, it's about observing and working with what is. So the suggestion is to enter the system with curiosity rather than with preconceptions, to attune like an anthropologist would to the rituals, the stories, the underlying patterns, and to believe that change emerges not by imposing external solutions, but by engaging with the system and the way it actually functions, not the way we think it might function or we think it should function. The fourth element has to do with embracing paradox and emergence. And again, complexity theory here teaches us that multiple and seemingly contradictory forces like stability and change, control and creativity exist in tension. So the most transformative shifts there often emerge not through the rigid plans, but from within the group itself. So a Tavistock OD practitioner will trust the group process, will allow patterns and insights to emerge organically, and will really avoid presenting solutions, which is often very, very difficult because the organization force is very much to look to the practitioner, the external practitioner as an expert. And finally, to cultivate negative capability, which is a rather difficult concept to convey.
Everyone's looking at this like, what does that mean?
It actually comes from Keats, the poet, who wrote in a letter to his sons very many years ago, and he talks about negative capability. And Bion, that's Wilfred Bion, who is one of the founding members of the Tavistock way of working, talked about that. And essentially, it is about the ability to tolerate doubt and ambiguity and the not knowing without grasping to various premature answers. So what is implicit in that, it's a stance which takes a lot of learning and practice, but it's a stance which implicitly suggests humility and the idea that we are here to explore alongside, to accompany our clients in their journey in the unknown. So if you like, we are experts in walking in unknown terrain. We're not experts in finding the route through the terrain.
We're all practitioners in organisations, aren't we? And organisations really value certainty, don't they? They value the right answer. They value being able to give accurate timings to things. But a lot of change, what you're saying there, is therefore it's unknown. We don't know what it's going to do, and we don't know what's going to happen. But so therefore, we need to turn up a little bit differently.
Exactly.
It's really fascinating. It's a real sort of change of mind, isn't it, to a lot of sort of traditional change management as well. One of the things that the Tavistock does a lot of is looking at things like the unconscious, and that's just something that's really worth exploring. What is the unconscious in organisations? What role does it play?
Okay, and the unconscious is a concept that first was developed by Freud in his model of conscious, subconscious he spoke about, which is another way we speak about it in OD, is the liminal space and the unconscious. The unconscious is those aspects that we are completely unaware of. And if you like, what personality is to the individual, culture is to the organization. So the way we can see unconscious dynamics in organizations is often through conflict. It seems irrational, resistance to change in a sense of in places where actually we might be surprised because we were invited into the organization to change. So why the resistance? And sometimes by patterns of scapegoating or on the other side of that, idealizations. So these forces, they shape the team culture, they shape performance, and they often they shape those more than the formal structures and the strategies. So not paying attention to them means missing a crucial part of this organizational puzzle.
And I get, because we do see things like lots of conflict in organisations and scapegoating. So it's often is not what it seems. There's something going on beneath the surface that we need to explore to understand it.
That's right. It's not what it seems, or it might be repetitive, or it might be contrary to what is the spoken. So those levels are all the levels that we need to think on our feet and be able to navigate, including what is going on for us. So I would say a bit more about that later, I think.
Please, yeah. And you've got an example there of a senior leader.
I still have again, it's an example from our beloved NHS. It's an occasion where a senior leader was unconsciously positioned as the hero, which means And often leaders are expected to solve all conflict, to make all the decisions, to know everything. In coaching, I think there are a lot of people who do coaching in our audience today, and they have probably found that from their own experience that this dynamic can lead to and also to unspoken feelings of shame as the leader struggles with what is an impossible expectation to be all-knowing. Meanwhile, other team members feel disempowered, they might feel withdrawn or kind of forgetting about their own accountability and authority. So what we then often do is develop spaces for group reflections and facilitated sessions where the team can begin to explore what are their projections, to recognize the emotional undercurrents that are at play. And importantly, we need to find ways to bring compassion into the process so everybody can recognize also the vulnerability in the leadership of the leadership and shift towards a more shared model where effectively we go back to the point about embracing uncertainty and developing, understanding the interdependencies and therefore developing resilience, and crucially finding ways to move from a blame culture to a place where learning is possible by accepting mistakes.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I think probably people can identify with a lot of these things that they share.
I think so.
Yeah, it happens so easily. And just for the audience, if you do have questions about anything that we're talking about here, or maybe even your own examples, then please feel free to add them in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up at any time as well. So please go on. It's really fascinating.
I think a deep reflection is like a habit. It's like a muscle that needs to be developed, and it's often the main route to facilitating lasting change. I would say we're not working with magic wands, or as my friend and colleague Steve Hirschel recently published in his book, "There's no silver bullet." Is very much the way that the Tavistock stance has always been active. It takes time, it takes a lot of interaction and communication, and then we can help teams bring hidden patterns to light, work through emotional undercurrents and patterns, and shift into the organization into a culture which can sustain itself by a process of ongoing learning. So learning, the capacity to learn is key. Not to say that generally in the world we're very good at that. I think we aspire to that, and that's a good start.
Yeah, you touched on a really important point there, isn't it? Is that often we're sort of projected into the role of hero ourselves, aren't we? Like, fix this.
Exactly.
You, HR, come in and be the silver bullet and try and fix this. But it's not as simple as that, is it? And sometimes we have to sort of decline that invitation and find a new way of doing it.
It's very tempting, though, because the alternative is often to be ourselves in touch with feelings of helplessness or even hopelessness, depending on the context where we were.
Brilliant. And when you talk about reflection, like how much should that be woven into our work? Is it something that you do quarterly? How often should you be doing it as part of your natural practice?
All the time, whether you do it via working with your peers, whether it's through supervision, whether it's through working with the client, and all the time.
And you talk about creating spaces for open dialogue, reflection, and shared leadership. Can you just say a little bit more about that? What does that look like?
It looks like exactly that. It's about finding, obviously, through negotiating with the client, and obviously you need to take the pulse of the organization in terms of what's possible, when and how. But essentially, it's about finding, ideally, let's say, a rhythm, which is a certain space where these conversations can take place over time, over a certain period of time, frequent intervals, but not too frequent, intervals that allow for other things to bubble in between spaces.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the most important things that OD can do, is actually just opening that space up, because that space often doesn't exist, does it? So it is about bringing people together and facilitating that in a really carefully designed way.
Yes, and often it might exist, but then, especially if you work in the public sector and possibly in the voluntary sector where there isn't a lot of funding these kind of spaces are often, sadly, the first to go rather than those that stay. So it does depend on how the organization or the leadership of the organization understands what is required.
Brilliant. So we've got a quick pause there. So if anybody has any questions, or if anybody's got any observations or even sort of personal experiences with it, maybe see sort of people projected into the bowl of hero, maybe the example resonating with you, please do feel free to raise your hand or just put something in the chat as well. So we'll keep things moving, because we're going to talk about in a few moments, we're going to talk about boundaries as well, because that's a really important part of the practice, isn't it, within organizations?
Yeah, it's a very, very key concept, boundary. I start with my favorite way of understanding and explaining boundaries, which is drawing attention to us when we were born and reminding everyone or telling everyone, depending on where you come from, that the very first boundary that we come to know when we are born, which is pre-verbal, is that of our skin. And the skin is the largest and most vital organ in our body, by the way. And without it, we will not know we will basically disintegrate without our skin. Our skin is the first way that we learn to distinguish what's me from what's not me. So our skin, the other point to say about it, is a semi-permeable system in its own right. It protects us, it differentiates us, as I said, but it also allows exchange, without which we will also not survive. So a good example is being in the sun, which we all hope will come our way soon, so we can
one day
in the near future. And the sun, gives us the vitamin D that we need, so it keeps us healthy. But it can also, with too much exposure, can hurt us and burn us even. So the purpose of the skin is to be this filter which helps us adapt to the change that is afoot, and also to continue to maintain a health of our body, which of course in certain perspective is also more holistic than that. So in a similar way, you can think about boundaries in OD practice and in organizations generally. The boundaries create structures and containment. They're also, if you like, a good way to think about them is to think about them as interfaces. They provide spaces for the interaction, for the negotiation, and for learning. So what we constantly do in our organizations, in our team, as individuals, in our wider systems, we navigate across boundaries. What does that mean? We navigate between roles, identities, different authorities, and importantly, tasks. Task in itself is also a boundary, in the sense that we need to understand its purpose, our role in relation to it, so that a boundary, what is expected of us, that's another direction that the boundary goes at. And therefore, the OD practice is really not about removing boundaries or enforcing them, but about understanding and working with them, bringing them to the surface consciously, so that we can move within that pattern of relations called organization without losing our coherence.
Yeah.
Shall I carry on or?
There's certainly questions. Keep going. This is so fascinating, because I think it's probably resonating with organizations are full of boundaries. Even like the way the organization is designed into functions means that you're constantly able to transcend it. But those relationships don't happen by accident, and you've really got to work at them to make them to work productively.
They're also intention, they're intention with each other. So, for example, if you asked me in our prep, what happens when boundaries are unclear or violated? And I had a little bit of a reaction to the word violated, because the common fear around this idea of violating boundaries is that it can sometimes lead to avoidance and to silence and to shutting down real conversations in the name of safety. But actually, what we do at the Tavistock, when I say that we create safe spaces for difficult conversations, is that real psychological safety is not about an absence of tension. It's about the opposite. It's about the ability to engage with difference, to engage with challenge, and with the discomfort. When the boundaries are too rigid, we cannot talk about things, basically. And when they're too weak, then everything can collapse into a confusion. So neither are safe or supportive. So when we work with boundaries at a deeper level, we need to recognize that these are the spaces where we encounter the difference, we explore the differences, we negotiate them, and then we can hold the working through across them. So there's a saying about let's agree to disagree, which is the least dialogical thing one could say, really. It's a kind of an eliminating of difference. Or on the other hand, what people might say, well-meaning people might say, we are all the same, we are all humans, we are all the same. No, we're not that either. We're actually different, and it's very curious to understand and discover more about how we're different, and the more we can discover about ourselves, the more we can understand the other, and vice versa. So to work across differences and across boundaries can be really engaging and meaningful and exciting, and lead to much more substantial and profound and lasting change and transformation and development and growth.
Yeah, that's really powerful, isn't it? So it's not that boundaries are a bad thing, and that differences. It's about making sure that we explore those things in detail. So your skin analogy has gone down really well in the chat.
Okay.
So people are really resonating with that as well. So that sounds like
and of course, they can be abused as well, and they can be used as exertion of power, and they can be politicized or weaponized. And likewise, since the skin analogy is going down well, likewise is the skin. Of course, we know a lot about that in our practice and in our understanding of diversity and difference, how the skin can be also weaponized.
Just made Bally's point. So Bally made a really interesting comment. She said there are also cultural issues related to skin. It can be seen discriminatory in some cultures, very similar to work cultures as well, a tribal mentality.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's a really nice point. And thank you so much for everyone jumping into the comments as well. Some really insightful things being shared. And this is a really open session, so please feel free just to share your observations, because the group really benefits from that as well. Shall I move on?
Yes.
Boundary work, not about balance.
Yes, just a few. No, I don't want to sound too solution driven and how to do things, but it's probably important when you practice as an OD channel just to hold a few more concepts in mind. And for me, concepts from complexity theory are very important, because boundary work is not about balancing or about harmonizing. For me, and in the way that I view the world of practice and the world of theory, it's about holding what is apparently contradictory in creative tension. Like I said here, what apparently could be contradictory, structure versus flexibility, autonomy versus accountability, belonging versus difference. They are actually work develops, our understanding of self and other and group and organization develops when we hold this with, if you like, the Gestalt concept of figure and ground. They're always coming in and out of sight at the same time. We don't want only one or the other. We want them always to be alive and visible and work with, and never resolved in a way, never resolved. That's the way we want to keep going, means we never resolve this. There's always another question. There's always another step. There's always another terrain to work in. And these are the sources for growth, for learning again, which is really how I understand organizational development. It's about learning.
The chat's really hotting up here. So Deborah Dre just made a lovely comment. She said, basically, acceptable boundaries change from person to person. And we are seeing major tensions these days with the cultural shifts and changes in expectations about what is normal behavior, especially intergenerational tensions. And the problem is a lack of open-mindedness to alternative viewpoints. we have an environment of cancel culture and fear. So I guess is there any sort of there that sort of resonates with in terms of like even just acceptable boundaries change from person to person?
Yes, and also the comment about the intergenerational is a very important boundary in organizations, how to work across the different generations that exist in the organization.
And
that's very alive for me.
Paul's made a really good point. He said, so not necessarily polarities, but contradictions instead. So, because you kind of talk about polarities, don't you? So opposites. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think polarities are, is Paul suggesting contradictions is the word instead of polarities. That's fine. And if you hold the polarities at the two ends, but you put them back together, that's where they meet and they can live in this creative tension. Yes. So it's holding, if you like, both and also. We like at the Tavistock the model of the third. The third is always the one that helps us to not flatten the line, if you like.
Brilliant. I'm learning. So this is I'm happy. This is great. We'll move on to group dynamics and roles. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to be greedy and ask the questions that you'd like as well, because it's really adding value to the conversation. So we asked you about group dynamics, and you also talked about someone called Wilfred Bion, who was a part of the Tavistock as well. So some people may not be familiar with his work, but it's fascinating field, isn't it? Group dynamics.
Yes, it is. So the group dynamics in the Tavistock model are not just a collection of individuals. They function as living systems, and they are shaped by both the conscious and the unconscious forces. And people take up roles, sometimes deliberately, but sometimes unconsciously. They form alliances, conflicts emerge, and also unspoken norms govern those behaviors. And in Bion's model, I will try to say it very, very briefly. So he was quite optimistic in terms of his attitude to the capacity of groups to work. And that is possibly because he was actually a military psychiatrist. So he worked a lot with the application of group's power, if you like, of group's capacity to heal and of the group's capacity to work. Work was, work to the task was very important. But as a psychoanalyst, he was also very aware of anxieties. And he suggested that at any time, the group can fall out of, if you like, its focus on its task because the anxiety has gone up too much. And then he had a few propositions of what that might look like, but I don't think I would go into that right now. But what I also wanted to link into this idea of group dynamics is that they exist and you can see them at any level. So when I was preparing for this section, I hope I'm not going to be gaining some enemies right now, but I live near the Arsenal football stadium, and in the background, the Arsenal-Man City match was happening. And what I always notice, but I don't go, that's too much for my heart, I don't go to the actual match, but I hear the crowd, and I have learned to recognize the sound of the crowd, in terms of when it's a goal, when it's the opponent goal, when it's a save, and so on. And what you become very conscious of if you watch or listen to the football is that even without words, these thousands of people move, react, and respond in some undecided but self-organized synchronicity. And what I would like to say is that the crowd develops its own rhythm. It could be joy, it could be frustration, it could be anticipation. And in teams and organizations, if we go, if we narrow down the level again from the big crowd to the organization, all the way to the interpersonal, all of these are also at play, and we can listen to them. We can listen out for them and then see them in unspoken loyalties, silent tensions, shared aspirations, and a lot of group emotions, which often are either defenses against or expressions of feelings of exclusion as opposed to belonging, competition or even rivalry, which is more destructive, and jealousy or envy, which is again more disruptive, and of course the power and the politics. And if we listen to them, then we can get a sense of what shapes the collective behavior. And then we need to find a way back to the individual and help the individual find their own sense of self and authority within them. And I would just say that links to another very important concept of Bion, which was the concept of valency. So valency, in simple terms, is the buttons that can get pressed in us. And they get pressed mostly unconsciously because those behaviors have served us very well in our lives. So, for example, the class joker, when tensions are high in the classroom, you can guarantee there's the kid that cracks the joke, makes everyone laugh, and diffuses the situation. They probably learned it back in their family or home setting where they became the funny person who helped when anxieties or tensions in the family, in whatever constellation, were too high. And then one day, they're now in their 40s or in their 50s, they're a senior manager in an organization, and they go to coaching and they say, I'm always the one who cracks the joke, but recently people started to tell me that it's tiring, that it's unhelpful, that it's out of sync with my role as a leader, and I don't quite know what's going on. So then a Tavistock coach would have the opportunity to draw some connection between the valency, i.e. the tendency of the person to deal through a rather, quick and brief, sometimes sense of humor by cracking a joke to diffuse a situation. But actually, when they sit there as a manager of a team, it's not necessarily the most appropriate reaction anymore. So that's when you can help the leader discover that what has served them very well throughout their lives, that's the compassionate stance, may be no longer helpful. And by bringing that into awareness, they might now have the opportunity. They can still choose not to, but they have the opportunity to choose differently the way that they respond to a situation and work with it. So that's, in short, the concept of valency.
And teams do use things like humour a lot, don't they, to sort of work through difficult moments. And it's understanding what it's about. I'm desperate to get to the next slide because it's about interventions and stances for this as well. So you talk about group dynamics and some of the potential interventions that we can do, whether we're internal, external as well, don't we?
Sorry, the cat has arrived. So practical intervention or stancing, definitely the first one is the organizational development consultant as an anthropologist. And what I mean by that is working with what is rather than what we assume or desire things to be. It means that we approach the organizational life with curiosity rather than judgment, being attuned to the unspoken norms, to the rituals, to the emotional undercurrents, as I said previously. It is also about seeing ourselves not only as a participant, but also as an observer, but not only as an observer, also as a participant, which means that in our practice, everything that we require of the other, we require of ourselves first. So developing capacity to use ourselves as the tool is a very important aspect of the way we work. And in psychoanalytic terms, I will be talking about transference and countertransference. But it's essentially what I've just said is about recognizing the space of our own reactions to the situation and bringing that into the learning space. The other one is understanding systems as fractals. Wherever the intervention is located, and whether it's at a small or a larger scale of location, it can have an impact on the entire organization or system. So whether you work with the board or you work with one of the departments, you're likely to find the same pattern re-emerging. in a slightly different way, but in a self-similar way, similar enough, but it gives you the clues and the know-how to work with it. Now, it doesn't mean that what the intervention is necessarily going to have the impact in the way that you planned for or wanted it to be, but it will have an impact. And then it's about how you navigate between them. And of course, very much key to the work of the Tavistock is having a space for the resistance, understanding it, letting yourself go into it. If you like the model of letting go to letting be, and then the idea is that when you work with it and let yourself and the system go into it, it is more likely that people will find their way out and change it in a paradoxical way. So basically, successful interventions will require both the observing of the system and the willingness to experiment within it. Like how Kotler used to say, in order to understand the system, you do need to experiment within it, reflect on it, and then know how to take your next step with it.
Gosh, this is fascinating. If you are seeing this for the first time, there's just so much incredible insight coming out here. And we've got a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. So Christian has asked a question. Thank you, Christian. In the current world of speed and change to survive approach, how do you look at the time taken for OD initiatives? So they're causing contrast, aren't they? Like we're moving at a breakneck speed, but OD initiatives take time to identify the patterns and then start to make some change in engagement as well.
Yeah, I think that's a key challenge really for all the practitioners who want to work with the Tavistock methodology. It's a key challenge for us. I can say that often organizations try a lot of quick fixes, solutions, or off-the-shelf processes, and over time they discover that these don't work, they don't last, because they haven't dealt with the persistent problems which reemerge in different ways, which are under the surface. So eventually they call the Tavistock Institute. But I don't even have a simple answer to that. I think it again requires a negotiation. If practitioner wants to work in a particular way, it's the onus is on us to explain why this way of working is eventually more sustainable. One of the things we say sometimes is our job is to make ourselves redundant, which is also a double-edged sword, because if we're successful, then that's exactly what it is. We're no longer required in the longer term. So it's also about the practitioner being able to take the risk that, we might be out of a job for a while. And of course, if this is our only source of income, then that's a tension for us as individuals as well, which is why we are often tempted to work in other ways.
Debbie just had a question just in terms of, in order to break lifelong habits, do you think that time-constrained coaching interventions are useful as opposed to something that's more intense and ongoing to break those habits?
I think for me personally, short-term work, be it in coaching or in therapy, which is my other identity, is always a little bit of a challenge. I'm much more comfortable with meandering for a while and being able to have that space, but it is a positive challenge, and I like to take it on every now and again. And I don't like to have clients for years either. I don't think that's particularly helpful. So I think everything has a space. That's the thing. In a perfect world, we would be able to change from one way of working to another. But I also have had, if we're talking about coaching, I have also had over the years many people who complete one cycle and then I don't hear from them for months or years, and then they come back for another reason to do another short-term piece of work, focused work about something that bothers them. So over a long period of time, I'm seeing them in the longer term, or accompanying them as they change their careers and move and navigate in their world. So that's a great privilege if you can be that person to them as well.
Appreciate it. Well, great question. Great question. I think it resonates with a lot of people. So just in the last 5 minutes, Eliat, can we just look at systems thinking in organizations? I won't interrupt you. I'll just let you share what you'd like to share.
I think the key indicators for us to notice or to have, the light bulb alert that we are dealing with whole system issues could be things, I think I said it before, that persist despite perhaps our conscious effort to move on from them. So this could be things like high turnover, silos, recurring conflict, and because they seem to be unshiftable, it could mean to us that there's something going on under the surface that needs addressing. I will give you a very quick example from work that I did. It's also published in a book, so you can get hold of it. My colleague Manisher and I did work with a lithography R&D company called ASML, and one of the structures that we noticed there is that the company had two presidents: the CEO, who was very diplomatic and outward-facing, and the CTO, who was the Chief Technology Officer, who was a genius technologically, but very tactless. So the partnership often looked like the one saying something which was offending to some provider or in the wider context of the wider ecosystem, and then the CEO fixing that through his capacity. But what we have in order to obviously together in that kind of a pair intention, they sustain the huge success of the organization, huge success. However, what we noticed over time as we walked around the system is that this kind of fight, interdependent, confluent pairing existed in many different pockets in the organization. So, for example, the engineers versus the physicists were in great apparent tension around their collaboration or pulling in different directions, which of course has an impact to the lower level practitioners of the organization. So then we began to understand, and that's where the fractal idea of system thinking becomes very relevant. Then working with that means that whether we couldn't really work with the presidents, they were not interested. So we worked at other levels of the organization, brought that dynamic into awareness with the people themselves, shifted that, and then slowly it dissipated actually and worked through that way. So you don't always have to work with the top. To the question about the short term, of course, that's where it's useful. If you can't get access to the top and the top is really open to look also at their own contribution to the dysfunctionality in the organization, then it's a win-win because you can, obviously, because of their authority over the organization, change can be quicker. But more often than not, the top likes to believe that the problem is outside of them. The board hardly ever wants to acknowledge that itself is the problem in the relationship. They like to see it in the wider system. So then, yeah, by all means, if you get the mandate to work in the wider system, go for it, because you will have sustainable change at the end of that. So when you think about systems perspective, you want to think about organization not in terms of linear cause and effect thinking. Pay attention to the interdependencies and the hidden dynamics, and then with the aspiration to move from a blame and quick fix culture to a curiosity and long-lasting learning. So this is my kind of work over the years, and also why you can call me a doctor. So I think working with shame is really, really key in a transformative change. And my thesis, my thinking is that shame is not about a paralyzing effect, which of course it can be, but working with shame as a transformative aspect. So unlike guilt, which I can say a lot more about, which focuses on the individual wrongdoing, is relational. and it can help us to reveal where the organization is stuck, exposed, or uncertain. When staff is then held with compassion, shame can become a gateway to growth, allowing organizations to engage with their vulnerabilities rather than defensively repeating old patterns. So I will just read what I put on the slide. By fostering spaces for reflection, psychological safety, and exploratory thinking, OD practitioners help organizations stay with the discomfort. Often shame, of course, leads to great discomfort, long enough for meaningful change to emerge rather than retreating into defensive routines. I really wanted to say something about shame.
It's so important, isn't it? Because it's often so suppressed in organisations, isn't it? We just try we stay away from it. Yet that's where the change can potentially come from, isn't it?
Yes, I would just say, rather than repeat myself, I would just say on the very end bullet point is that shame is our friend in our work. To know and to have empathy for our own shame, to put ourselves in a learning place. And by that, I would encourage everyone to come and do some work with us at the Tavistock Institute. You can also then learn to work with others' shame and then lead to a lasting transformation.
Well, thank you so much. You've just condensed so much into 50 minutes. So I just want to say a huge thank you. We've had so many people engaged in the process of the questions we haven't got to. So Aggie was asking a question about the role of middle management in unlocking change as well. So everyone will receive a copy of the slides. If people want to follow your work, if they want to engage with you or just learn a little bit more about the Tavistock, what's the best way for people to do this?
So I embedded a link here to our professional development page. And I think at the beginning of the slide, I embedded a general link to the Tavistock Institute. And I think this is the best way, write to us, join our newsletter, follow us, talk to us, do one of our programs, many of our programs.
Well, thank you so much. There's loads of lovely comments coming through in the chat. This takes a lot of preparation to do a session like this as well. So we really appreciate the time and thought you put into it.